After 5 years of dating, Gary Stroud suddenly announced his engagement to someone else. He handed me the invitation. I just need 3 years. I'll get a divorce and give you the grandest wedding. I looked at the happy couple on the invitation, and my breath stopped for a few seconds. Are you really going to betray our 5-year relationship for a business marriage? Gary lowered his head and didn't answer, his silence saying it all. My heart completely broke. I took off the engagement ring he gave me and threw it in his face. I didn't tell Gary that his fiancée was the adopted daughter of my family. And I am the true heir to the family fortune. He wants to expand his business through marriage, but he's picked the wrong person. Ding! This novel reminds you to click the subscribe button in the bottom right corner to read the complete novel. When I got home after a terrible day, Gary still hadn't returned. I clutched the nearly deformed invitation tightly and collapsed weakly on the sofa. The adopted daughter my parents took in 10 years ago is getting engaged next month. And her fiancé is my boyfriend of 5 years, Gary Stroud. When I saw the photo on the invitation, my first reaction was denial. Gary proposed to me just 3 months ago. How could he be marrying someone else so soon? There must be some misunderstanding. I didn't turn on the lights and sat on the sofa, waiting for Gary to come home and give me a reasonable explanation. I waited from dawn till dusk, and finally, I couldn't hold on and fell asleep on the sofa. When he came home, it was already late at night. He reeked of wine and stumbled towards me. Layla, I need to tell you something. Hearing this, my heart skipped a beat. Seeing me curled up on the sofa without moving, Gary impatiently pulled me up by my arm. Stop pretending to sleep. This is not a joke. I often pretended to sleep, acting cute so he would carry me to the bedroom when he came home late from work. He would always affectionately tap my nose, and without even taking off his coat, he would carry me in his arms. But today, his attitude was unusually cold. I instantly lost the desire to communicate with him. I opened my eyes and looked at him coldly. Gary sat down beside me and took out a familiar invitation from his suit jacket. I had already received a copy of this invitation during the day. I raised an eyebrow and said calmly, "Is this your engagement invitation for me?" His expression faltered, surprised by my calm reaction. Layla, there's something I need to inform you about. I'm getting engaged. The fiancée is the daughter of the Hurley group. My heart, which had been hanging all day, was finally pierced by his words. I forced a smile. Gary Stroud, you could have waited until your wedding day to tell me. He frowned deeply. He pressed his lips tightly together, looking unusually serious. Layla, I'm not joking. The Stroud Group needs support for its next phase of development. You should be well aware of your background. You can't help me. He stuffed the invitation into my hand, avoiding my gaze out of guilt. This invitation felt like a piece of burning coal, scorching my palm. Gary, just because I can't help you, does that mean I deserve to be abandoned by you? I felt a lump in my throat, wanting to question him, but I didn't know where to start. He pondered for a few seconds. When he looked up at me, his eyes were already brimming with tears. He grasped my shoulders with his large hands, swearing an oath. Just give me 3 years, and I'll divorce her and give you the grandest wedding. Gary had made many promises to me. But to this day, very few had been fulfilled. I looked down at the photo of the happy couple on the invitation, my breath stopping for a few seconds. Back then, you said you didn't like taking pictures. No matter how much I begged, you were unwilling. Do you remember? His eyelids fluttered, his thin lips moved, but not a word of defense came out. Recalling Gary's resolute refusal to take pictures with me formed a sharp contrast with him now. He didn't dislike taking photos, he just didn't like taking them with me. My burning tears fell onto the invitation, leaving a water stain. Gary Stroud, are you really going to betray our 5-year relationship for a business marriage? You had many opportunities to tell me the truth. Why did you choose today? His face, whether from drinking or guilt, was exceptionally red. He kept his head down, not saying a word. But his silence spoke volumes. I took a deep breath. Do you remember what today is? He lifted his eyelids slightly but still didn't dare to look me in the eye. I've been too busy lately, I can't remember. My heart completely sank. Today is the day you promised to go wedding dress shopping with me. A month ago, I had set the date with Gary. But now, he had completely forgotten about it. A flash of panic crossed his face. He wanted to embrace me as he used to when I got angry. I stood up abruptly, pulling the diamond ring off my ring finger. Then I threw it heavily at his face. Gary closed his eyes instinctively as the ring hit him, a hint of anger in his voice. Layla Hurley, can you stop making a fuss? If your family background was better and could help the Stroud Group expand its business, would I need to marry someone else? I've already promised to divorce in 3 years. What more do you want from me? He stood up, his 6'1" frame instantly blocking the light above my head. I looked up at him. So, what do you want me to be for the next 3 years? A secret lover hidden from sight? Or a kept woman? My words seemed to hit Gary's sore spot, exposing his true intentions. He raised his hand and slapped me unceremoniously across the face. The crisp sound of the slap echoed sharply in the empty house. I was knocked to the side, helplessly collapsing to the ground. The house was eerily quiet, only the sound of our heartbeats could be heard. After a long while, Gary sighed, squatted down, and gently stroked my burning cheek. Layla, I won't allow you to belittle yourself like this. You are the most important person in my life. Even if I get engaged or married to someone else, no one can ever take your place in my heart. Gary's slap had left me dazed. It wasn't until he bent down to pick me up that I fully regained my senses. I pushed him away, raised my hand, and returned his slap with all my might. With hatred, I used all my strength, leaving a bright red handprint on his face. Under his gloomy gaze, I resolutely turned around and left with a parting shot. Gary Stroud, you are truly hypocritical to the extreme. I moved out of the Stroud house. Gary didn't stop me, only said he would find me a new place to live. After all, this house where I had lived for 5 years would soon become Gary's marital home. It wouldn't be appropriate for me to stay here any longer. From beginning to end, I never told Gary the truth. The woman he had schemed so hard to marry wasn't the real heiress of the Hurley family, but an adopted daughter of the Hurley family. It was only then that I realized who my parents had been talking about when they mentioned that blind date a month ago. At the time, considering Gary, I had decisively refused my parents. Helpless, my parents had no choice but to send my non-biological sister to the blind date instead. It was supposed to be just a formality, but who knew they would actually hit it off? Thus, the marriage was arranged smoothly. I didn't accept Gary's arrangement to move into that new house as his kept woman. After being away from home for 5 years, it was time for me to go back. As soon as I entered the house, I saw Daisy Hurley twirling around in the living room. When she saw me, her eyes lit up instantly. Layla, come and see, isn't this dress beautiful? The haute couture dress she was wearing was a new release from a few days ago. Before it was officially launched, Gary had said he would buy it for me as a Valentine's Day gift. Daisy ran over and grabbed my hand. This is a gift from my fiancé. He said it wasn't easy to get, he had to pre-order it more than a month in advance. My heart shattered into pieces once again. This time, Gary had indeed kept his promise and bought the dress. But unfortunately, it wasn't for me. I forced a smile. It's very beautiful and suits you perfectly. As I went upstairs, I could still hear Daisy's laughter in the living room. She was like an innocent child, lost in a house made of candy, unaware of the harsh realities of the world. How could I bear to shatter her sweet dreams? I go to work and come back home every day as usual, hiding the turmoil in my heart well. But when I come home from work, I always forget that I've already moved out of the Stroud house. The 3rd time I went to the wrong house, I ran into Gary. He didn't even wait for the car to stop before opening the door and running towards me. After a few days without seeing him, he looked a bit haggard. Layla, why haven't you answered my calls these past few days? Didn't I explain everything to you that night? All of this is just a temporary measure. I don't want to break up with you. I took a few steps back, keeping a safe distance from him. Gary Stroud, you're already engaged, you should be more mindful of your boundaries. His half-raised hand froze in midair. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke. Layla, why can't you ever understand my difficulties? It's not that I don't understand. When I realized Gary wanted to expand the company's business, I thought about helping him. As the sole heir of the Hurley Group, marrying Gary would solve all his problems. But just when I wanted to marry him the most, he abandoned me without hesitation. I looked at his well-tailored suit and asked knowingly, "Mr. Stroud, you have a banquet to attend tonight, don't you?" He nodded slightly. Then he quickly changed the subject. "Why didn't you move into the villa I arranged for you?" I waved my hand. "Mr. Stroud, I still have some dignity. I don't want to be your hidden mistress." Gary pinched the bridge of his nose and spoke helplessly. "Layla, that's not what I meant. Where are you living now?" I didn't tell Gary my address. Anyway, we would meet again at tonight's banquet. I pushed him towards his car. "Mr. Stroud, you should hurry to the banquet. My affairs have nothing to do with you." With that, I took out my car keys from my bag. The next second, the headlights of a Bentley parked not far from Gary's car flashed. Gary, who was about to leave, turned around in shock and looked at me. "Layla, is that your car?" I smiled faintly and calmly got into the car under Gary's gaze. Tonight's banquet would announce the engagement of Gary Stroud and Daisy Hurley. As Daisy's sister, I naturally had to attend. When I got home, many guests had already arrived. I went straight upstairs to Daisy's room, intending to reveal the truth and stop her from making a mistake. As soon as I opened the door, I saw her sobbing quietly in front of the dressing table. "Daisy, it's your big day, why are you crying?" Upon hearing my voice, Daisy immediately looked up. She took something out of the drawer and turned her tear-streaked face towards me. "You've been dating Gary Stroud for 5 years, haven't you?" I paused at the door. Going in or out was not an option. I opened my mouth. "Daisy, I didn't mean to hide it from you." She walked towards me, holding a somewhat worn red string in her hand. "Layla, you also have a red string like this, don't you? Your red string has a small gold key on it, and Gary's has a gold lock." I didn't deny it and hung my head like a child who had done something wrong. Indeed, it was my fault for hiding this from Daisy. After a few minutes of tension, Daisy threw the red string away and hugged me tightly. "Layla, you're really foolish. 5 years ago, you fought with our parents over a man, and now you've been deceived by him. Do you still want to bear it alone?" This red string was thrown away by Gary in front of me to show his loyalty. The strength I had pretended to have for so many days finally crumbled because of my sister's words. I couldn't control myself anymore and burst into tears. Yes, I was really foolish to think he loved me. After a long time, Daisy and I finally pulled ourselves out of the pain of being deceived. I stopped her from reapplying her makeup. "Since you have seen his true nature, let's call off this engagement. I will explain everything to our parents, you don't need to worry." Daisy smiled. "Layla, if you haven't seen Gary's true face exposed, why let him off so easily?" I paused and looked into Daisy's clear eyes. We instantly understood each other's thoughts and smiled. The banquet went on as usual, and the engagement announcement would still proceed as planned. I stood on the second floor, watching Daisy lift her skirt and step down the stairs. Gary stood not far away, his eyes full of affection. At this moment, his eyes were only on Daisy. Daisy affectionately took Gary's arm and spoke sweetly. "Gary, I forgot to tell you before, I actually have a sister." Gary kept his body turned towards Daisy, patiently listening to her. "You have a sister? How come I've never heard of her before?" Daisy smiled innocently. "I'm the adopted daughter of the Hurley family. There's only one true daughter in the Hurley family." "Gary, I thought you knew before our matchmaking." Daisy's words were like a bolt from the blue for Gary. His mouth twitched uncontrollably, and his face turned pale. "What did you say? You're adopted?" His voice rose, attracting the attention of the surrounding guests. Then he lowered his voice. "Why didn't you tell me this before our matchmaking?" Daisy's eyes instantly reddened. "Gary, did you only want to be with me for the Hurley family?" At this point, Gary gradually lost his composure. As he struggled to control his expression, I slowly made my way down the stairs. Daisy took the opportunity to walk to my side and held my arm. She didn't speak again, leaving the stage to me. I extended a hand to Gary. "Mr. Stroud, nice to meet you." At this moment, Gary's eyes were hazy and vacant. The champagne in his hand wobbled and spilled onto his tailored suit. Realizing his faux pas, Gary frantically fumbled for a tissue. I smiled lightly. "Mr. Stroud, why don't you go upstairs and change?" Before Gary could respond, Daisy lifted her dress slightly and shifted responsibility. "Gary, my dress tonight is really inconvenient for going up and down the stairs. Let my sister take you up." Gary didn't refuse. We all knew that once he learned my true identity, he would have something to say to me. And those words were clearly not meant for the ordinary me from before. Just as we reached the stairs, a strong force pulled me into a corner lounge. The door slammed shut with a bang, causing the walls to tremble. Gary's eyes were bloodshot as he trapped me against the door. "Layla, why didn't you tell me before that you're a daughter of the Hurley family?" I frowned, displeased. "Gary Stroud, can't you read? My last name is Hurley. If I'm not a daughter of the Hurley family, could I be a daughter of the Stroud family?" Gary was choked by my words, and his face darkened. His large hand gripping my arm made me wince in pain. I could understand Gary's current panic and helplessness. After scheming for so long, he finally realized that he was the clown performing a solo act. Gary moved closer, burying his head in the crook of my neck. "Layla, let's go explain everything to your parents right now. I won't get engaged to Daisy. The only one I love is you. Let's announce our engagement tonight, okay?" My neck felt a bit damp and cool. When Gary lifted his head again, his eyes were already filled with tears. "All this time, I've been trying to find a way to not betray you while still marrying into the Hurley family. Since you're a Hurley, I don't need to force myself to marry your sister anymore, and you can always be with me." Having been with Gary for 5 years, I thought I knew him well. But at this moment, looking at his tear-filled eyes, pretending to be sincere, I realized how unfamiliar he was. I used all my strength to push him away. Gary lost his balance, stumbling several steps back before falling onto the carpet. In the dim room, I spoke calmly. "Gary Stroud, you may have no shame, but the Hurley family does. If you publicly break off the engagement tonight, you'll hurt not just me, but also my most cherished sister." I bent down and grabbed his tie. This tie was a gift I gave him with my first paycheck. He wore it to his engagement ceremony with someone else. I didn't know whether to praise Gary for his deep affection or blame him for his fickleness. I sighed. "Gary Stroud, you brought this upon yourself. Stop doing things that make me hate you even more." When I left, Gary was still sitting on the floor, dazed. I don't know how long it took, but by the time all the guests downstairs had arrived, Gary finally came down from the second floor, his steps unsteady. Daisy and I exchanged a glance, and she still affectionately took his arm. "Gary, why do you look so lost? Could it be that someone has bewitched you?" Gary raised his head at her words and glanced at me before quickly looking away. "I was just thinking about where we should have our wedding in the future." My heart tightened, and the hand holding my wine glass trembled. This was a question I had discussed with Gary countless times. But each time, he had dodged it with various excuses. I looked up and met Gary's gaze head-on. This time, he didn't look away in panic but stared straight into my eyes. Trying to find an answer in my eyes. Flirting with another woman in front of his fiancée, Gary was still quite the player. I coldly said, "Anywhere but Iceland." Gary's lips turned even paler, his Adam's apple bobbing up and down, unable to make a sound. Daisy quickly followed up, "Why not Iceland?" I smiled without answering, my gaze sweeping over Gary's ashen face, rejecting the flirtatious look he sent me. Because Iceland was where Gary and I had planned to have our wedding. Gary's tears fell without warning. The guests around us joked that Gary was so happy about his engagement that he cried. The banquet continued as usual, and Gary and Daisy's engagement was settled. Shortly after the banquet ended, I received a phone call. It was from the hospital, saying Gary had been in a car accident on his way home. I spoke calmly. "Why are you calling me about his car accident?" The nurse on the other end was silent for a few seconds. "Because you're listed as Mr. Stroud's emergency contact." I had the phone on speaker, and the 3 people present heard it clearly. My heart leapt to my throat, my eyes darting between my parents. Daisy hurried over, snatching the hot potato from my hand. "Layla, why are you answering my phone call?" Urged by my parents, I took Daisy to the hospital. When we arrived, Gary had not yet come out of the emergency room. I looked up at the light above the emergency room door, then down at the trail of blood along the corridor. My heart felt as if it was being tightly squeezed by an invisible hand, making it hard to breathe. Daisy's hand covered mine, and she softly comforted me. "Layla, I know you can't let go of this 5-year relationship just yet. If you want to cry, just let it out." I withdrew my gaze and suddenly spoke. "No, I'm just praying to gods, hoping they don't succeed in saving him." Daisy's mouth twitched, but she didn't interrupt my prayers. But in the end, God didn't favor me. Gary was saved, he didn't die. When he was wheeled out of the emergency room, the anesthesia hadn't worn off, and he was babbling nonsense. The nurse, accustomed to such situations, gave a brief explanation and left in a hurry. Gary lay there with his eyes closed, yet his hands were busy, waving at the air. Until I let my guard down for a moment, and he grabbed my arm. Gary's tone was full of pleading, almost choking. "Layla, don't leave me. When the Stroud group gets back on track, I'll marry you and give you the grandest wedding, okay?" I turned my head and saw a tear slide down Gary's face. It's said that under full anesthesia, people speak their truest thoughts. But why was Gary still lying to me? My eyes filled with heat, blurring my vision. "Daisy, do you think there's something wrong with my eyes, that I can't see people clearly?" Even knowing that Gary chose his career over me, I still softened at this moment. I even wondered if Gary really had his reasons. Daisy patted my shoulder. "Layla, you've done enough. Over the past 5 years, you've helped the Stroud group so much behind the scenes. Gary may not know, but I certainly do. He was the one who abandoned you, he was the one who let you down." Gary fully woke up the next day. He had clung to me all night, nearly dislocating my arm. When I saw he was awake, I quickly stood up and moved out of his reach. Gary struggled to sit up, trying to grab my hand. "Layla, you still care about me, don't you? Otherwise, you wouldn't have stayed here with me all night." I rolled my eyes at him and opened my phone to the payment app. "Your hands clung to me like pincers all night. The missed work fee and caregiver fee total $3,000, please pay up." Gary stared at me for a few seconds, as if petrified. After all, I had taken care of him countless nights without sleep before, without ever charging a penny. Now that I think about it, it really wasn't worth it. Seeing no reaction from him, I took his phone and transferred $80,000. "This money is for all the times I took care of you when you were sick or drunk." Just then, Daisy walked in. "Layla, I brought breakfast. Eat something and don't worry about that guy in bed." She stopped mid-sentence when she saw Gary was awake and swallowed her words. I tossed Gary's phone back to him. "No worries, he's still under the influence of anesthesia, acting like a fool." Daisy gave a knowing smile. The next second, she dropped a bombshell. "Layla, don't you have a blind date in a couple of days? You should go home and rest up." Gary, who had been sitting on the hospital bed for a long time, finally reacted. He didn't even bother to remove the IV from his hand as he clumsily fell off the bed. I had never seen Gary so disheveled and desperate. He struggled to crawl towards me with his bandaged arm. "Layla, why are you going on a blind date?" At this moment, Gary didn't care that Daisy was still in the room. He crawled towards me with difficulty, his freshly bandaged leg leaving a long bloodstain on the floor. But Gary seemed to feel no pain, loudly questioning me. "Layla, how can you go on a blind date? You clearly only have me in your heart." My calm attitude drove Gary completely mad. His eyes were bloodshot, and tears streamed uncontrollably. I glanced at him coolly. "If you can go on dates, why can't I?" Gary froze in place. "I did it for the Stroud group, it was just a temporary measure, don't you understand?" I interrupted him, pouring a hot cup of soy milk on his face. "I'm dating for the Hurley group." Gary finally regained some composure. I picked up my bag, ready to leave. But Gary suddenly hugged my leg. "Layla, if you're marrying for business, why can't you choose me? At least we truly love each other." Hearing this, I stopped in my tracks. "Gary, it seems the anesthesia hasn't worn off yet?" I grabbed his hair and turned his head in another direction. "Your fiancée is sitting right there, do you think she's dead?" Daisy, who had been watching the drama from the sidelines, was already crying like a weeping flower. Gary finally came to his senses, realizing his outburst. He frantically crawled on the floor, trying to explain to Daisy, yet unwilling to let go of me. In the end, he knelt on the floor, covering his face and crying. "I'm sorry, Daisy, the one I love is not you, but your sister. Can you bless us and cancel the engagement?" Daisy put on a look of genuine heartbreak and ran out, covering her face. "Gary, do you hate me that much? Do you want to hurt everyone I care about?" I turned around and slapped Gary, who was trying to explain himself. His face turned as pale as snow, except for the bright red handprint where I had struck him. His eyelashes were slightly wet. "Layla, I didn't mean to." For the first time, the arrogant Gary stepped down from his pedestal and knelt before me, begging for forgiveness. "I won't let Daisy be wronged. I can compensate." As I walked out of the hospital, Daisy was sitting by the flower bed at the hospital entrance, drinking milk tea. Seeing me, she quickly ran over to claim credit. "Layla, how was my acting just now? Wasn't it great?" I fondly ruffled her hair. "It was excellent." On the way home, I recounted Gary's words. Gary was willing to transfer 10% of Stroud Group's shares to Daisy as compensation for breaking off the engagement. Holding the steering wheel, I felt a bit bitter inside. He really went all out this time. I wasn't jealous of Daisy, I just felt my 5 years of effort were worthless. I had been with Gary for 5 years, and he never mentioned transferring even 1% of shares to me. I followed him abroad to start a business and then back to develop it. I helped him secure countless investments and deals, which he accepted as a matter of course. He didn't even bother to say thank you. In the end, all I got was, "Why don't you just leave the company?" Daisy, bored, played with her phone. "Layla, I don't care about the shares. Just put the 10% in your name. That's what Gary owes you." Actually, Gary made a miscalculation. When he realized Daisy was an adopted daughter of the Hurley family, he decided to break off the engagement. In his mind, an adopted daughter could never become the heir of Hurley Group. So, whether out of reason or emotion, he completely excluded Daisy. But what he didn't know was that in my parents' will, Daisy always had equal shares with me. I shook my head. "No need, I don't care about anything from Gary Stroud anymore. When I went on a blind date, I didn't dress up specially. It was just another routine task, not worth much effort." Halfway through lunch, Daisy called me. She sounded anxious. "Layla, I just went to the hospital to get Gary to sign the share transfer agreement. But when he heard you're really on a blind date, he ran out of the hospital on crutches. What should I do? The last page isn't signed yet." I was stunned for a few seconds, momentarily lost. Gary's current condition couldn't support him walking far. I was just going on a date with someone else, why did he have to go crazy to this extent? I didn't care for his belated affection at all. The man sitting opposite me noticed my odd expression and slowly wiped his mouth. "If you said your backyard was on fire or flooded, I could understand. Such a poor excuse, I didn't even use it when I was a kid." I twitched my mouth. "It's not that. It's just that my sister's fiancé heard I was on a blind date and came to stop me on crutches." The man clearly didn't expect me to give such an explosive excuse and almost choked on his water. He cleared his throat and said faintly, "You might as well say the backyard was on fire." I was amused by his serious manner. Before my laughter died down, the restaurant's glass door was shattered by a crutch. Gary's arms and legs, wrapped in bandages, were oozing blood. He walked towards me, barefoot on the glass shards, limping. "Layla, didn't we agree a few days ago? I'll break off the engagement with Daisy and compensate her with 10% of the shares. We can start over." Gary staggered, trying to grab my hand, but lost his balance and fell right in front of me. I didn't spare him a glance, continuing to calmly cut my steak. The man sitting opposite couldn't help but ask. "He's collapsed by our table. Aren't you going to help him?" I lifted my eyelids. "Mr. Drake, I'm not a compassionate person." Chris Drake's thin lips curved slightly, and he followed my example, calmly cutting his steak. "What a coincidence, I don't have any compassion either." In the entire restaurant, the only sound was the crisp clash of knives and forks between Chris Drake and me. Everyone turned to look at us with curious eyes. After a long while, Gary, who had been curled up on the floor, finally managed to recover. He struggled to support himself with the dining table and barely stood up. "Layla, are you really going to go on a blind date and spend your life with someone you don't love?" My hand paused as I was cutting the steak, and I almost wanted to stab this knife directly into his heart. I wanted to cut his heart open and see which words were true and which were false. Chris Drake intervened at the right moment. Feelings can be developed over time. I smiled. Mr. Drake makes a good point. Gary was unwilling to give up and glared fiercely at Chris Drake. He gritted his teeth and said, "Mr. Drake, Layla is my girlfriend. Do you think it's appropriate for you to go on a blind date with her?" Chris didn't seem like someone who was easy to mess with either. He put down his knife and fork and calmly adjusted his perfectly ironed suit jacket. "Mr. Stroud, I heard you're actually engaged to Layla's sister. Is that true? What, you can't let go of either sister? At least leave some room for other guys." Gary, enraged and humiliated, raised his bandaged arm, ready to hit someone. Chris raised his hand and directly pushed him away again. Gary fell heavily to the ground, making a dull thud. I was so shocked that my lips parted slightly as I looked at Chris Drake. He extended a hand to me, a slight smile on his lips. "Miss Hurley, would you like to continue our date somewhere else?" I placed my hand in his large palm and picked up my bag, ready to leave. Gary suddenly grabbed the hem of my dress, his emotions agitated. "Layla, I was wrong. What do I have to do for you to change your mind?" At this moment, Gary had no dignity left in front of me. Pitiful and pathetic. I let go of Chris's hand and squatted down to meet Gary's eyes. "Gary, why don't you transfer 20% of your shares to me? Maybe I'll consider it." A spark of hope lit up in his empty eyes. "Layla, are you serious?" He must have been confused by anger to take such words seriously. I smiled softly. "Gary, you fool, if you lose 30% of your shares, you won't be the largest shareholder of Stroud Group anymore. What will you have left? How will you be worthy of being with me?" Gary was awakened by my words, his face showing conflict. But he still didn't give up. "Layla, how about I transfer 15% to you? After we get married, all the money I earn will be yours." Using such a small amount of shares to try to tie me down, it's a pity I'm no longer the Layla Hurley from 5 years ago. I shook my head and disdainfully pushed his hand away. "No. Do you know how many connections of the Hurley Group I've used behind the scenes in the past 5 years to get you to where you are today?" Hearing this, Gary seemed to suddenly understand something. Starting from scratch isn't that easy. Gary's ability to create a financial miracle in 5 years was all because the Hurley family served as his stepping stone. But what did Gary do for me? I took Chris's hand and left him with one sentence. "Whether Stroud Group exists or not is entirely up to me. So, you'd better not mess with me." Gary really didn't come looking for me again. After Chris and I left that day, Daisy hurried to the restaurant with a contract. After seeing the contract, Gary didn't refuse and immediately signed the last page. He also wrote another contract, giving me an additional 15% of the shares. When Daisy brought this contract to my room, I had just finished a call with Chris. I threw the contract aside and lay back on the bed. "Just 15% of the shares? I'm not interested." Daisy laughed, and as she laughed, her eyelids drooped. "Layla, I saw something off about Gary today." I was replying to Chris's meaningless messages and didn't take Daisy's words seriously. I casually replied, "What's off about him?" Daisy lay down beside me and handed me her phone. It was a video she had secretly taken of Gary. In the video, Gary was dejectedly leaning on a cane and got into a car that drove away quickly. Daisy was a bit worried and tugged at my arm. "I asked the hospital this afternoon, and Gary hasn't gone back. Layla, do you think he might be thinking of committing suicide by jumping into the river?" My typing paused, and I turned to look at Daisy's worried face. "What? Are you still worried about that man who used and schemed against you?" Daisy pouted. "Not really. I'm just worried that if Gary dies, our share transfer agreement will become invalid." I put down my phone and sat up, taking a deep breath. "Don't worry, he won't die. A person who values their career more than their life wouldn't die for a woman. If he could stay down for a few days, it would already be the last bit of respect Gary gave to this relationship. As I expected. A week later, Gary, still injured, appeared in a news interview. On TV, he looked noticeably thinner and had lost his usual spirit. With the help of his assistant, he stared directly at the camera. I have canceled my engagement with the second daughter of the Hurley Group. From now on, I will officially pursue the eldest daughter of the Hurley Group, Layla Hurley. The shocking news Gary revealed pushed both the Hurley and Stroud families into the spotlight. He shamelessly continued, "To show my sincerity, I have transferred 15% of my shares to Miss Hurley, and she has accepted them. I have complete confidence in the marriage alliance between the Stroud and Hurley families." When I saw Gary's speech on TV, I was completely stunned. I never would have dreamed that he and I would become entangled again in this way. To me, this wasn't Gary showing weakness, it was him openly provoking me. 3 minutes after the news ended, Chris's call came through. His voice was still gentle. "If you accept his shares, do you have to agree to marry him?" I didn't say anything and kept scrolling through the tablet, checking the constant stream of messages. His voice on the other end became anxious. "It's just a few shares, don't agree to marry him." My eardrums buzzed. "Then what do you suggest I do?" Now, not only my parents and Daisy, but also the shareholders of the Hurley Group were bombarding me with messages. "Dad, Layla, how did you get involved with Gary Stroud?" "Mom, Layla, marriage is not a small matter, especially since you don't even like him." "Daisy, Gary Stroud is so shameless. He told me those shares were compensation for you. Now he's using them to morally blackmail you." I closed the message page, feeling a bit exhausted and somewhat amused. Gary was like a cornered rabbit, starting to bite back wildly. Chris, not getting a response, was nearly shouting, "I'll find a way to handle this. As long as you stand firm, there won't be a problem." Before I could answer, the phone went dead. Actually, I wanted to tell Chris that this matter was just a small issue for me. I drove to find Gary. It was as if he knew I would come. He was waiting at the door with a bouquet of flowers. "Layla, I knew you would come." My gaze fell on the flowers in his hand. "Gary Stroud, you are truly shameless." Wearing 10-centimeter high heels, I kicked his uninjured leg. He winced in pain and knelt on one knee before me. He chuckled softly, "As long as I can get you back, my pride means nothing." He crawled towards me on his knees, took a diamond ring from the flowers, and tried to put it on my hand. I broke free from his hand and slapped the ring away. "The shares were voluntarily transferred by you. This is what you owe me for the past 5 years. If you really have no shame, then I'll tell the media how you've been climbing up by relying on women all these years." His eyes flickered. Suddenly, he threw the bouquet heavily on the ground. "Layla, what have I worked so hard for all these years? Isn't it all to give you a good life?" He struggled to stand up and looked me in the eyes. "But what about you? Why did you hide your identity? Making me, like a fool, give and plan." His roar kept stimulating my eardrums. I instinctively took a few steps back but was then supported by a pair of large hands. I looked up and saw Chris's chiseled profile. "Why are you here?" Chris let go of me and magically produced a contract. "Since someone is using shares transfer as a way to pursue you, I can't lose." He flipped through a few pages of the contract and handed it to me. 20% of Drake Group's shares. "Layla, don't I seem more sincere?" Gary's face turned pale instantly. His reddened eyes stared fiercely at Chris. "Since when is it your place to interfere in matters between me and my girlfriend?" Chris wrapped an arm around my shoulder. With a hint of a playboy's demeanor, he said, "Just because you say a few things to the media doesn't make it true." He cleared his throat. "On the way here, I also made an announcement to the media." I turned my head to look at him. "Announce what?" Chris gritted his teeth. "Of course, I announced that I am transferring shares to pursue you." Looking into Chris's clear eyes, my heart raced. At this moment, Gary, like an outsider, was completely broken. He struggled to walk towards me, trying to separate me from Chris. "Layla, you came to see me today. You must have something to say to me, right?" He grasped my wrist, tears streaming down his face. I rarely saw Gary cry. In the past, every time he cried, I would soften. But now, seeing Gary's tears, I felt no sympathy at all. Thank you for reminding me. I do have something to say to you. His dark eyes instantly lit up. The grip on my wrist tightened a bit more. Layla, I knew you were just speaking out of anger earlier. You've finally changed your mind, haven't you? I broke free from his hand and took out a document from my bag. Gary Stroud, I watched your company grow from the ground up. You don't need me to count how many financial and technical tricks there are, do you? Hearing this, Gary took a few steps back in fear. He looked at me full of vigilance, his tone filled with disbelief. Layla, the company also has your hard work. You still own shares now. What are you dissatisfied with? Do you want to report me and completely bring down the Stroud Group? I nodded. That's exactly my intention. Gary seemed to have all his strength drained, collapsing to the ground in despair. His eyes were empty, muttering to himself. Layla, the company is the fruit of our love, 5 years of our hard work. How can you bear it? I was no longer interested in a single word Gary said. Before I came to see him, I had already submitted all the materials and reported Gary under my real name. I came now just to inform him. Consider it an end to the past 5 years. I turned to leave, and Chris hurried to catch up with me. His tone was much lighter. If you had told me earlier you were this fierce, I wouldn't have gone through so much trouble. I glanced at the share transfer agreement in his hand. Regretting it? Don't want to transfer the shares anymore? Actually, I didn't care about the shares of either Gary or Chris. After all, I was about to inherit the Hurley Group. Chris, like a cat with its fur standing on end, raised his voice several degrees. How could I possibly regret it? As he spoke, he shoved the agreement into my arms. I've already signed it. Once you sign it, the contract takes effect immediately. I looked up at Chris's serious face. His eyes were pure and clean. Just like Gary's 5 years ago. I smiled and declined, getting into the Bentley. Chris, you can't win someone's heart just by throwing money around. He stood there, dumbfounded, not reacting. I rolled down the car window. I'll give you a chance to pursue me, but whether you can catch up depends on you. With that, I stepped on the gas. Within 2 months, the Stroud Group was investigated for tax issues. Coupled with internal strife within the group, Gary, who had lost most of his shares, ultimately failed. The last time I saw Gary was during a date with Chris. He watched me from a distance but did not approach. I pretended not to see him and continued to eat the cake Chris fed me. After a while, when I turned my head, Gary had already disappeared. Daisy once asked me where the solitary Gary would go. I shook my head and did not answer again.